All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's podcast. Thank you very much to everybody who is joining us live, and for everybody commenting in the live chat already. Good to have you on board. As usual, we have a special guest today, somebody who I've been meaning to speak to for a while, and I'm happy that we have the chance to do it today. Please, as along with Ahmed, help me welcome to the show Kanchan Gupta. Kanchan ji, welcome.
Namaste, Kanchanji. Thank you very much for coming with us.
Also, Kanchanji, if I know a lot of people who are watching here already know who you are, but if you want to just give us a small background about yourself, that'd be great.
No, I really don't have much to say about myself. Uh,
That's a first. People generally like talking about themselves.
no, I don't. I have spent most of my life in media. I began my career with the Telegraph in Calcutta, straight out of college. Um, MJ Akbar was launching the paper, and he had put up a small note on the college notice board. I walked down to his office and I began working. So I spent about 5 years at the Telegraph, then moved on to the Statesman, which was the biggest paper in those days. I was an assistant editor with the paper, again for about 5 years. Then Vinod Mehta invited me to join the Pioneer in Delhi. I shifted to Delhi. Uh, Again, about some 6 years later, I left the paper to join the office of Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And subsequently, I worked in the Prime Minister's office when he was the Prime Minister. Uh, I did time in Cairo as director of the Indian Cultural Center over there. And then I returned to India in 2004. I went back to the Pioneer as an associate of the paper. And subsequently, I left the paper to start something which was way ahead of its time, called Niti Digital. We were doing a lot of digital work, including the country's first digital radio.
Oh wow!
And it didn't quite work out the way we wanted it to. I did some television work with ABP News, and then roughly about 3.5 years as a distinguished fellow at ORF. And right now, for the last few months, I have been working again with the Government of India as a senior advisor in the Information and Broadcasting Ministry. With a, I mean, I don't really have a brief. I do whatever I'm asked to do.
Sure. So, in your experience, in the last however many years you've been working in media, how have you seen the media landscape change? Because I feel like there's been such a, maybe it's just me, and it's sort of recency bias, but since the dawn of social media, I feel like there's been such a sea change in how the media conducts itself. And it might be because the media, for the very first time in a very, very long time, sees that there is a very strong challenge to sort of their unquestioned authority as a result of social media. Have you seen any kind of like significant behavioral changes since you worked in media to maybe 2021, 2022?
Uh, Actually, it's slightly more than that. But I have seen the evolution of media, and when I joined newspapering, although the Telegraph was printed offset, but those were the times of hot metal press when
Right.
typesetting would be done on hot metal. And in the Statesman, that's what I learned. I mean, uh, how to make half-tone blocks and duotone blocks and how the hot metal press works. And believe it or not, those days there was a special allowance for people who worked in papers which operated on the hot metal, and that was a milk allowance.
Oh,
So
wow.
all the zinc fume that you consumed was supposed to be countered by milk, and there was a special allowance called the milk allowance. So
Oh,
from
wow.
there to phototype setting and offset printing, and of course it's now changed entirely. Most of it is automated. The news desk is no longer what it used to be. Now you
Hmm.
have combined news desks and things like that. So it's a technological change. There's a human resource change, and it's a different ball game.
Right.
But you see, globally, what has happened is that mainstream media is now a smokestack chimney, a
Hmm.
smokestack industry. Newspapering and newspapers have no future, and they have lived out their life cycle. And all over the world, newspapers are now either downsizing or shutting down or making a switch over to digital medium.
Yeah.
But at the same time, even uh, uh, television again, it took off like a rocket, but it is now plateauing, and very soon we may see the demise of even television.
Yeah.
What has become the dominant player in the mediascape is social media, uh, where there has been a huge democratization of the way information is generated, the way it is shared, the way it is consumed, and the way people respond to it. And that, I think, has sort of created this new landscape where media is now entirely redefined, and I don't quite foresee big players remaining dominant players anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you mention that you don't see big players remaining dominant players or big players anymore, I think that has caused that's the behavioral shift that I was talking about, especially since the advent of social media is because of the democratization that's happening, because all you basically need, for at least video news, all you need is a camera and a microphone, and you can be a journalist if that's what you're inclined towards. It has caused, I personally feel that it's caused a very serious change in the way news is covered, and especially in the way news is reported. And I feel like, being from India, I've seen that in India most acutely, the way the coverage of news has been shifted. A very good example very recently was how the coverage of, Prime Minister Modi's security breach that happened in Firozpur in Punjab, how that was essentially covered, because there was a section of the media, they're so either ideologically inclined, or they're either in such a state where they have to pander to their core base, that even such a strong security lapse was on, passed off as, "Arey, ye to either the Punjab government has nothing to worry about, they're not at fault at all, this was actually something that the Modi government should have cared about," or, there's a lot of mudslinging going on. And I feel like mainstream media is in such a fight for survival right now, that they're leaning into their most rabid base, the base that they can make most of their ad revenue or subscription revenue from. And
Clickbait journalism.
yeah, it's essentially clickbait journalism to gain more subscribers as well.
It's like not
And
necessarily telling the
huh,
truth, but printing whatever sells best, whatever makes them the money
yeah.
more.
And you can see that, Kanchanji, in other things as well. Obviously in the last 5 or 6 years, it's more recent, so we remember it better. But you look at the discussion around something like the CAA, you look at the discussion around the farmers' protests, you look at the discussion around something like the Lynchistan from a few years ago as well. And I honestly have not seen any media house or any major mainstream media publication or like a news channel or anything like that offer a nuanced even discussion around what the idea of Hindutva is, which is it's supposed to be the ideological plank of the BJP. But I haven't seen any major news outlet seriously sit down and academically discuss ki, acha, what exactly does it mean when the BJP talks about Hindutva, or when a regular Indian that votes for the BJP talks about Hindutva. We just don't see that at all. We see is mud singing, is we see name calling, and we see media houses really leaning into their most ideologically radical sort of viewership base.
There's, I mean, all that you have said is true. Uh, but if you look at the media landscape today, it's a very sad reflection of certain realities. Uh, Now, before I get into that part of it, uh, the when we were talking about democratization and the manner in which information is produced and consumed. If you look at the total viewership of stuff that appears on YouTube, I
Yeah.
mean, your show and then hundreds of other such shows, if you look at the total viewership, and if you look at the total viewership of the many innumerable news channels in India, you will find that YouTube viewership is actually way ahead of
Mm.
television viewership. So if somebody were to ask me, what would I mean, what would be the best way to sort of put out a story or put out an idea or put out a message,
Yeah.
I am now veering round to the view that people should look at YouTube.
Mm.
People should look at similar other platforms where the messaging can be far better because the consumption is much higher.
Mm.
Now, whether that content is good, bad, I'm not getting into a value judgment over it. So that is the shift that has taken place. When television became a big thing, newspapers tried to emulate television by getting into breaking news, by getting into a 24-hour news cycle, by chasing stories and then
Mm.
dropping them without even taking the story to a formal conclusion. And now that television has been replaced by social media, like say Twitter, so we are seeing the Twitterification of mainstream media. Now, Ahmed here, he mentioned clickbait journalism. So this clickbait journalism is basically a very sort of desperate attempt to become an extension counter of Twitter or Coup or other such platforms.
Mm.
Now this doesn't really work. So and that actually adds to the discrediting of mainstream media. I mean, it's not a very nice thing to say, but you are like the proverbial Dhobi's dog. You neither belong here nor there. So
Yeah.
that's something which has happened, and it's not a very happy thing to happen. But that is only one part of it. The second part is, people talk of ideology, but if you look at the people behind the news that comes out,
Yeah.
I doubt if they have the intellectual honesty to be ideologically committed. So they would
Mm.
rather sway with the wind, and they are basically posiers. I mean, they would want the world to see them as ideologues and ideologically sound and firm, but they aren't.
Mm.
And lastly, the way media is funded. People talk of independent media, but that's a misnomer. There is nothing called an independent media anymore, at least in India. Uh, every bit of media that you see is part of a larger business conglomerate. So you have someone who is a real estate dealer, who is also who owns factories, who owns oil refineries or whatever, is into something else, and he also has a newspaper or a television channel or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's you are compromised that point onwards, and after that, anybody who puts up the money, you sing for him. You are singing for your supper.
Mm.
Yeah, since you mentioned oil refineries, I guess those publications won't give much coverage to, say, Greta Thunberg.
No, I don't think
Oil
Greta
refinery.
Thunberg is a big story in India. I mean,
Mm.
and honestly, I wouldn't hold media responsible for it. I don't think people give much of a. I mean, they aren't really bothered about it.
Yeah.
Yes, that intellectual honesty bit was a really good point. So, like, it reminds me of Tim Pool, for example, who told this story about how he used to work for Vice Media, and then one day they got together in a board meeting, and they were like, "This wokeism thing, this is what sells right now. This is what we should go into." And that's when he quit the company, and he said, "No, I'm not doing this. I just want to tell the truth."
Yeah.
And Vice, when wokeism slid, they also went down. And now Tim Pool, for being honest, for just doing the job of telling the truth like the media should, he's now bigger than Vice
Yeah.
because he was intellectually honest.
So another thing that I've noticed, and I can understand the Indian media or the whatever Indian independent media, they have these vested interests, or they have these backers and donors that they have to be accountable towards, let's say, or they have to they're trying to pander to a particular reader base. What I find very interesting is in recent times, especially since COVID, I've seen this increase even more. Well, this used to happen before as well, but I've seen this weird obsession, this morbid, macabre obsession that Western media sort of has with India. Sushant Sareen, I think, on Twitter made a very good point where he was talking about, there's more than 1 million cases in the United States right now, but you have all of the major publications in the United States, like New York Times, Economist, you have Bloomberg, Washington Post. They're all so laser focused on why Indians are not dying, on why they're so surprised. Ki, "Arey, we need some more Indians to die. They're not wearing masks. They're outside. Why aren't they dying?" They seem to be just really disappointed why they're not dying. There are articles about like why there's mask hesitancy in India, even though there isn't really that level of mask hesitancy. There used to be some articles back in the day, I remember last year, about vaccine hesitancy in India. That's proven to be completely wrong by the sheer numbers of people that are getting vaccinated in India. And at a time when that level of, or a higher level of mask hesitancy, let's say, exists in the United States, definitely a much higher level of vaccine hesitancy exists in the United States. You have these media outlets that are just so obsessed with the fact that more Indians are not dying of coronavirus. I wonder what the idea behind that is.
Again, I mean, it's a layered story. You are referring to yesterday's or today's New York Times story, which talks about how Indians are not wearing masks, and that is fueling Omicron. Uh,
Yeah.
and I mean, as someone whose job it is to respond to stories, I put out I put out a set of photographs saying these startling pictures of Indians without masks and refusing the vaccine sort of validates
Yeah.
the New York Times story, and the photographs were all from America, of people demonstrating against masks and people with placards saying no to vaccine.
Yeah.
Now, it's a strange obsession. It is not a macabre obsession, but it's a strange obsession where you try to, every time things go bad or things go southward in America or in Europe, I today, I mean, it's very sad, but it's true. I refuse to call it Western media. I now refer to it as white media. The
Mm.
white media is busy putting out drain inspector reports just because they feel that by doing so, America or Europe are not going to look as bad as they look right now. Now,
Right.
I don't buy into that for the simple reason that this is a pandemic, and it is going to, it's going to screw the happiness of every country around the world, whether you are America, whether you are in Europe, whether you are in India. And to sort of pick up countries, or pick out countries and slam them, I think it's not only in poor taste, but it also shows a certain racist mindset.
Mm.
And there was this famous line that the white man is destined to carry the burden for the black man or the brown man. And that sense of carrying the burden for us, please don't, I mean, we don't want you to carry the burden for us. We are what we are, and we shall get through this.
Yeah. Yeah, it
Yeah,
is.
and unfortunately, the truth
Uh,
is that all these very negative reports about India, some of our own people seem to be publicizing them. It's like, see, even the US says things are really bad here, and that's just sad.
That's actually a very good point, because that was going to be my next question to you as well, Kanchanji, because and Ahmed made a very good point. I feel because I feel that whatever news reports that you see in Western media uh, that are generally made about India, this mask hesitancy, vaccine hesitancy, oh, people are not dying and things like that. Why are people outside on Juhu Beach? All these kinds of aggressively negative reporting that happens, there's usually Indians involved in that kind of reporting in these foreign newspapers. And I find that, again, that's a very, I find personally that it's a very unique characteristics of Indians. Because if you look at Pakistan, you have a country that's basically swimming in the toilet with chunks of poo. But despite that, you don't see that kind of attacks on Pakistan by Pakistani Americans or the Pakistani diaspora. But you definitely do see that with the Indian diaspora, sort of almost exceedingly so, like they're trying to make up for something. What do you think is behind that?
uh, if you are referring to Indians who work for foreign media or for white media,
Hmm.
uh, I think they feel elevated by their
Right.
association. Um, I mean, don't forget that this was a country where, um, India in those days. I mean, Calcutta was the second city of the empire, and
Right.
in Calcutta, there was the best part of Calcutta was called White Town. Now, it wasn't called White Town because white people alone lived over there, but because people Indians aspired to get a foothold into White Town because they felt that it would elevate them, it would make them more, uh, it would sort of give them social status, prestige, etc.
Sure.
So similarly, today when you see, I mean, people who would be otherwise unemployable in Indian media, or who did not uh, really move ahead in Indian media, they go ahead and sign up for a job with white media, and they feel that just because they're working for the BBC or the Washington Post or the New York Times, it gives them a certain sense of elevated existence,
Hmm.
which frankly isn't true. I mean, in today's India, people don't give a damn whether you work in a whether you work in a shopping mall,
Yeah.
whether you are an assistant at Pizza Hut, or whether you are an engineer, a doctor, or someone who works for Reuters or Washington Post.
And
That
arguably, you could say,
distinction.
Kanchanji, that Hindi language media in India is getting a lot more viewership, whether it's on the internet or whether it's on TV.
No, it was always that. It was
Right? Yeah.
always that. Indian language media always had a much higher readership
Hmm.
than in the English language media. Today, it has those numbers have really, really gone up, and people who are conversant with English, people who speak English, read English, write English. But I mean, I'm a Bengali. I would happily look at Bengali media or
Yeah.
rather look at English media. I mean, I look at English media. It's more convenient. That's about it. But if I were to be living in Calcutta, I would have been perfectly happy reading a Bengali paper or looking at or watching Bengali news. Similarly,
Hmm.
I think people in any other state would be doing that. I mean, in UP, For instance, the dominant paper is Dainik Jagran. People are more comfortable with it. So
Yeah.
that has always been the case, and it is right now. It has the stigma that once attached itself to Indian language media. That stigma has gone. But
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I have a counter question for both of you. I mean, how does white media live with its many lies? When BBC puts out a story that the vaccination program in India has failed, when sort of New York Times says that India is hit by is the worst affected country by COVID, and it goes
Hmm.
on and on and on. Similarly, when American media puts out photographs and videos of something very intimate, something very personal, something very tragic, like
Yeah.
cremating your dead, they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't do that for bodies being disposed of in America, whether being buried or cremated or whatever. Like I was talking to someone else, and I said that they never show photographs
Yeah.
of bodies stacked in meat trucks, refrigerated meat trucks. I haven't
Yeah.
seen a photograph of those bodies, and yet they have no hesitation at all. Drone photographs, nighttime photographs, so that it is more stark and more shocking. Why?
I think the Western media in this case is able to exploit um, sort of
The
where
sepoy syndrome, you would say.
a little bit, but I think in terms of the Western media, what they're able to do is they're able to exploit the image that the lay American audience has in their minds about India. So, first of all, the first thing is that other than the BBC, other than the New York Times, other than the Washington Post or whatever the hell they're watching on TV, other than that, where is an average American going to hear about India really? Or there's no other avenue for them to really learn about India, number one. So, essentially, as far as a lay American goes, whatever the BBC says or the New York Times says is the truth because there's no other avenue for them to find out the truth. Secondly, the lay audience doesn't really have an interest outside of following the BBC and the New York Times and the Washington Post for India news because I do think that the lay person, this does not apply to every single American, but I think still the lay person still has that image of India in their minds of like 40 or 50 years ago. It's like that. I don't know if you remember that scene from Munna Bhai MBBS where there's a Chinese tourist who is in India and
Poor
he's
hungry
clicking
people.
photos.
Poor hungry people.
Yeah, exactly. And Circuit goes and asks, "Ki, what are you doing? Why don't you take photo of Taj Mahal or something nicer, man? Why are you in this chawl?" And he's like, "No, I want to see real India, poor people, hungry people, shame, bilkul." So that is, I feel like, the lay audience still to a large extent in America and in the West. So whatever the BBC is producing about India, when they're saying, "Oh, look at all this vaccine hesitancy. Oh, look how miserably their vaccination program has completely failed," or "Look how many people are dying. Look at all these dead bodies stacked on top of each other." It's that image of India that gets reinforced in the minds of the sort of lay West European or the lay
Yeah,
North
I
American.
understand where you're coming
Yeah.
from, but I think it also raises a very serious question of media ethics.
Hmm.
And whether you are left or whether you are right or whether you are woke, uh, there has to be something called media ethics. I mean, you cannot move away from the fundamentals of ethics just because you belong to the right or the left, or you are a
Yeah.
woke, or you're a centrist, or whatever. And this I think has eroded uh, the the credibility of mainstream media. And while I can quite understand the average American looking at photographs in New York Times or Washington Post and saying, "My God, this is what they do to their dead," or whatever.
Yeah.
But how does it add? I mean, okay, it gives India a bad name, but how does it give Washington Post or New York Times a good name?
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't.
True. The
And this
picture
is
of
something which you
burning.
can't do. This is something
Uh,
which you just can't do, and you must not do.
I
the
think what
picture of
happens is, go ahead, Ahmed. Then I'll.
burning funeral pyres, for example. An American and an Indian would look at it through very different lenses. Like an American, the nuances would be lost on him. An Indian looking at the same thing, we would know that these photographs, the very existence of them, is highly unethical. You're not supposed to click photographs of such an intimate moment. There is that. And also, speaking of vaccine hesitancy, that also considering the cultural nuances, it's very different in the US and very different in India. In India, considering the successful polio vaccination program, we have a very positive feeling about vaccines. I
Yeah.
would feel there is more vaccine hesitancy in the West because
Oh,
there have
100%.
been some famous cases. I forgot the name. There was this one famous case where some big pharma company, like in India, I don't think we really have that concept of big pharma. It's more prevalent in the US. Big pharma, for those of you who don't know, it's like the corrupt big pharmacy industry. Wasn't there this case, Sham, in the US of a lot of kids dying because of a vaccine that was supposed to be good? And because of that, there's a very negative imprint about vaccines in
See,
the average American psyche.
what's funny in the US about this, people talk about big pharma, and I understand the issue with big pharma 100%. But the thing is, you have people in the United States that are against the vaccines. They're saying, "Oh, I don't like the vaccine doesn't work," or the big pharma is making the vaccines. Same people who are saying this about the vaccines and the big pharma, complaining about big pharma, are also promoting or supporting alternate medicines that are also, by the way, produced by big pharma. They're saying, "Oh, don't take the vaccine, take ivermectin." अरे, ivermectin कौन produce कर रहा है यार? The big pharma is producing ivermectin. So
Hmm.
on the one hand, you're complaining about the big pharma vaccine, but on the other hand, you're promoting big pharma medicine. So it's they're a little bit of a confused perm, जिसको बोलते हैं ना. But coming
No,
back
you
to the
see,
sort of, yeah,
when we are
Kanchan ji, go
on
ahead.
this point of ethics, Bloomberg ran a story, and to which I formally responded from I mean, as an official of the government. Uh, the story was that India incubated Delta variant of COVID, and then it sort of India sent out the variant to the whole world, and because of India's mismanagement and because of the government of India, countries around the world suffered. And believe it, they also made out a case, or they said that China also suffered because of
Oh
India.
my God.
Now it's there in it. I mean, you can just Google for the piece and you can read it yourself. I'm not making it up.
Yeah.
Now, when you put out something like this, and when it is a settled fact that no variant shall be described by in terms of this is the country of origin, because in a pandemic you can never say which variant is coming from which country.
Yeah.
Today you may discover a variant in America where you are sitting right now, but that variant may have come from a country which is thousands of miles away from America. Some traveler or a group of travelers may have brought it, and it may have been found and discovered and sort of identified by American scientists. That does not make America the incubator or the petri dish of that variant.
Mm.
And that is
Ultimately, the
why,
blame goes to China, of course.
no, I'm just talking of the variants.
Sure.
And,
Hmm.
and that is why the World Health Organization had firmly said that each variant will be known by a particular name and not tagged with any country. And despite this settled global story that India incubated Delta, and that India put out the mutant around the world, and
Mm.
that because of India, China suffered,
Wow.
It's ridiculous.
That's
and they get away
incredible.
with it. I mean, it's such. I mean, this is this is not only absence of media ethics. But what Bloomberg did, I mean, it is because they are smugly confident that nobody will be able to touch them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they get
Ahmed,
a
anything
pass.
to add? Go ahead.
And they get a pass.
Sorry, Kanchan, you go ahead. Yeah.
So no, the point again. I mean, I think the issues are much bigger than just clickbait journalism. I mean, it's laughable. I mean, if you go to today's or yesterday's New York Times story on Indians not wearing masks and how bad and terrible that is in pushing Omicron, if you just click on it, at least in India, you don't have access to the story. The first thing they ask you is for 50 rupees.
Yeah.
Yeah, since you talk about democratization of media, I was like, you want 50 rupees? Screw you. I'll just go to another website. The next result on Google. It's not like you're the only website over here.
Person providing this news.
And
Exactly.
Sham, a question for you since we are talking about vaccine hesitancy. See, vaccine hesitancy, I can understand. There is some cultural, historical context in the US. I can understand why people are scared. But what is it with mask hesitancy, man? You see people like the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro, and Matt Walsh, they are railing against masks. Like, kya hoga mask pehen lo na? Like, why so much angst
Yeah,
against
I
masks?
think I think what they're complaining about is at least this is my understanding. I might be wrong. I think what they're complaining about is mandates. They're saying that if the government is saying wherever you go you have to wear a mask, otherwise you'll be prosecuted. I think that's what they're complaining about. They're saying if somebody wants to wear a mask everywhere they go, we don't really have a problem with it. They're saying the government shouldn't be mandating it. That's my argument. That's what my understanding about what they're saying. Here is an interesting question, though. Somebody asked this, Kanchanji. This is from Vivek Sinha. He's saying, from a philosophical point of view, I still think there exists a pagan and a non-pagan lens. That a Western media or a white media taking superior upper pedestal against a pagan country which is rapidly developing. I do think there is some truth to that in the way India is portrayed in the media. Do you feel that at all?
Oh yes. Uh, you see, historically, uh, the the Christian West was never comfortable with the non-Christian East, uh, and history records this fact. Uh, More specifically, when it comes to India, the Christian West was never comfortable with the idea of a big country with so many followers of a religion called Hinduism. Now, Hinduism is a latter day coinage, but the whole idea, the philosophy, the thinking behind behind Sanatan Dharma, they were, all these Western scholars who tried to read Indian texts and translate them. What were they doing? They were not genuinely curious. They were not trying to sort of gather and share enlightenment. They were trying to probe and find out what is it that
Hmm.
sustains a religion through millennia, and why is it that it has survived more or less in its pristine form, at least the idea behind it. So this discomfort of theirs gives rise to this sense that India must be put down for a multiple reasons. I mean, again, I mean, I know I keep on repeating New York Times, but if you go back and look at the front page cartoon in the New York Times
Oh
on
yeah.
Mangalayan, where they show this cigar smoking, suited booted guys inside the club, and you have this Indian with a pagri and a buffalo knocking on the door. Now, this is not some intentional. This is not something which they thought up at the
Yeah.
spur of the moment. This is how they see India. This is how they see Hinduism. I remember when Atalji was Prime Minister and Jaswant Singh was the Foreign Minister. His mother had died, and in Rajasthan, at least that part of Rajasthan where he came from, the custom was that when your mother dies for a year, you wear a white pagri or something. And so Jaswant Singh, who was a traditionalist in that sense, he he would wear a white pagri wherever he went. And the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, was meeting, and uh, I think it was the Millennium Session, the 2000, the year 2000 session,
Mm.
and he was part of the advance team which had gone there. And New York Times carried a photograph with the caption, "An Indian official with traditional headgear." So you have the foreign minister of India,
Yeah.
which had by then become a declared nuclear state, being described in the New York Times and also in the International Herald Tribune, which would then reproduce and further amplify the crap that appeared in the New York Times.
Yeah.
And that's how we saw the photograph, an Indian official in traditional headgear.
Yeah.
So this kind of insensitivity, this kind of "I couldn't give a damn" attitude essentially stems from a sense of racial superiority. And as I said, this whole thing of the white man's burden. So I now, I earlier I would tend to think that maybe there is something missing somewhere. Maybe we are
Yeah.
not communicating right. Maybe, we have not been able to sell our story. But no matter how hard you try, India will forever remain the land of fakirs and the great Indian rope trek,
Yeah.
uh, and that's it. Snake
Yeah.
I guess
charmers.
I
Yeah.
guess it's
Ahmed,
a
go ahead.
question of image management also. Like, I'm old enough to remember the cartoon when it came out in print. Back
Mm.
then, the internet was just like picking up steam, and YouTube wasn't even a thing. This was like 5 6 years before YouTube. And now, even more than 20 years later, Prager University still continues to do the same thing.
Yeah.
Like, there is that horrible video where they've shown that like the British actually did a favor and they
Yeah.
civilized Indians by like, dude, have you googled Jallianwala massacre,
Yeah.
Jallianwala Bagh
And
massacre?
it's not just that. If you look at, it's very interesting. Something that I've noticed in the last 2 years, especially since the pandemic started and everybody's forced to stay in their homes. There's an article that came out right at the cusp of the new year in New York Times, which was about the paganization of America. And they were asking, is America becoming more and more of a pagan country? And to be honest, at least anecdotally, I don't have any hard data to back it up, but anecdotally, at least I see that that's true. You look at, there's so many people who share the photos of their homes and how they're surviving in the pandemic, and they have like, basically everyone I've seen has like a little meditation room where they're meditating. They have a little incense stick, they have a photo of Buddha, or they have a photo of Ganesha, and they're all sitting in their homes and meditating. Everybody I almost basically know is doing something, a version of something like that. But at the same time, what's funny, Kanchanji, is in what you were saying, is that I've seen a very strong attempt to also divorce India from this practice. Okay, I'm going to meditate. I have a photo of Buddha in my room. I have a statue of Ganesha in my room, but it has nothing to really do with India. There's nothing to. This is spirituality, man. This is just, this is mindfulness, man. It's they use these words like mindfulness, and they try very hard to separate any link of these practices from India, because when you link these practices to India, they feel like somehow these practices get tainted. So I do think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying.
No, you see, this whole thing, there is an attempt. I mean, apart from the fact that there is an aversion to India because it is a civilizational state, it is not a nation state that was created out of thin air like most of the Westphalian states.
Yeah.
Uh, so they are not able to understand, and in their inability to understand and to grasp lies their aversion. Now, apart from that, uh, when you talk of this whole thing about meditation, and I think yoga, some amount of yoga would be there, and the Buddha statue, that's not really worth talking about, because I don't think there is any great thought which goes into it.
Sure.
It's as fashionable as uh, furniture from a particular store or clothes from a particular brand. So it's that is not the real thing. Is that, for instance, this whole thing about Christians in India,
Mm.
and how Hindus are now going after Christians. That's rubbish. Now, the
Yeah.
way the media presented the story, for instance, about missionaries of charity, Teresa's missionaries of charity, uh, that their FCRA was blocked by the government, their bank accounts were frozen. That is not true. At least be honest. And again, I come back to the thing of ethics, media ethics. If you want to drive a narrative, fine, drive it, but
Mm.
try to do it from an ethical base. Now, the FCRA laws have been changed in India, and these were not changed. The changes have been happening over a period of time. The changes actually began when the UPA stroke Congress was in power.
Yeah.
The weeding out of NGOs which were using the FCRA route to bring in money for various purposes, and also by way of laundering dirty money. This process began before Modi or the BJP came to power. And now that this process has reached a particular point, it is upsetting a lot of people. Now, there was never ever any attempt to take punitive action against missionaries of charity, and it is important that this story should go out.
Mm.
They had to submit a certain amount of documentation under the new law to get their license renewed
Mm.
or their FCRA registration renewed. Now, the documentation which they submitted was insufficient, and uh, or that could have been because of oversight. It could have been because the laws have changed and they were
Mm.
unable to figure out what is to be submitted, what audited accounts had to be submitted. Now, if there was documentation missing, and they were informed that documentation is missing and we will not be able to renew it, please come back with the full documentation. Doors were not shut on them. Their accounts, the government of India never ever mentioned their accounts. And there was one pending case, one adverse report which was pending, which had to be dealt with. And now that adverse report was about orphans being sold from a missionaries of charity home in Jharkhand. It
Mm.
was an established report. It was investigated and found to be true. Missionaries of
Wow.
charity had accepted that their missionaries had violated the law, and that is the way it was. So they were asked to explain that there is this adverse entry, and how do you explain it, or what action have you taken? Now, that
Right.
is how the story begins. Once this happens, the first thing that the missionaries of charity did, because they have multiple accounts across the country, wherever they have a missionaries of charity outlet or operation, they have a bank account. So the first thing they did was to send out a circular from their headquarters in Calcutta, and that was the right thing to do. That was the correct thing to do. They sent out
Hmm.
a circular that please do not operate these accounts because anymore. Wait, and they informed the banks that please do not allow these accounts to be operated. Now they took the right decision, the right step.
Yeah.
But what was the political reaction? Mamta Banerjee comes out and says, I'm horrified and sad to learn that their accounts have been frozen and they have not been given permission. And just, that was the dog whistle. And
Yeah.
in a Pavlovian response, you had the entire left liberal establishment going bonkers. Oh, but Teresa's Missionaries of Charity has been delicensed by the government. Their bank accounts have been frozen. This was over Christmas.
Yeah.
The foreign media went berserk. They didn't bother to check, they didn't bother to take a reaction. The government of India issues a statement giving the sequence.
Hmm.
The missionaries of charity were far more honest. They issued a statement on December 27 saying that the government has not told us anything. We have been asked to submit fresh documents or more documents, whatever. I'm forgetting the exact language. And it
Yeah.
is we who instructed our people not to operate the accounts and inform the banks accordingly. Subsequently, what happens? The missionaries of charity come back to the home ministry. They come back with full documentation, and they get their registration renewed. They also submit that action has been taken against those 2 or 3 missionaries who were involved with selling orphans from the home in Jharkhand, that they have been expelled from the missionaries of charity, and action has been taken. Government said fine,
Yeah.
and that adverse remark was removed, and their registration was renewed. The missionaries of charity are happy. The government of India is fine with it, but foreign media is loath, or in fact, even Indian media for that matter, and these come politicians who actually dog whistled on this issue. They are loath to accept that they got it wrong, and we are sorry, we shouldn't have, we had insufficient
Yeah.
information, or that, or even blame the government that the government didn't tell us properly, so we got it wrong. But they won't
Yeah.
do that. 10 years later, 20 years later, sitting in America or Europe, somebody writes a book or does a research paper, thesis. The fact, what will come out, that this government blocked, you had a huge debate in the House of Lords
Yeah.
because their white media, the British white media, misled them,
Yeah.
told lies, was unethical. And based on those lies and that unethical reporting, the House of Lords sits and debates government of India blocking foreign funding for Mother Teresa and her charity.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It.
this reminds me of another
Yeah.
very deceptive story involving NGOs. Like in 2018, when the Statue of Unity was opened, of course, there was a lot of controversy around that. Public perception was that of most people that it's a big waste of money. And there was this story printed that India has spent so much on a statue. India receives X amount of money, so many $1 million in aid. Such deceptive wording. It's not as if the Indian government solicited that money.
Yeah.
It was private donations. And the way they worded that, it's looked like on one hand, the Indian government is asking for aid, and on the other hand, they're splurging on the statue.
And they're using that
It's
aid
as
money
if
to splurge on the statue, right?
it's as if मेरे मामा दुबई से 1,000 रुपए भेजे मुझे, making it look like the Indian government is begging for money.
Yeah.
It's all about deceptive wording in headlines.
It it brings me to this question as well, because I've been thinking about it for a while, because the way this two kind of dangers here. One, I feel like the Western media, they write these sensationalist stories about other countries, particularly India. it almost seems like it's being done to distract the audience from their own failings. It's being done to distract the audience from the media's role in Afghanistan. It's being done to distract from the media's role in the Iraq debacle. It's being done to distract from the media's role in creating a situation which resulted in something like what happened on the 6th of January and the fallout of that. I firstly, I'd like to know how much do you think there is to that, like to sort of cover up their own failings. Secondly, I also find it very interesting, and I don't really have a good answer for this question. That's why I'm asking you. But in a right now, the countries in the West are sort of locked into this battle with countries like China and countries like Russia, where you have this, governments that very strongly regulate or control their media. I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that India should follow anything close to a policy like that, but it's it is going to be very interesting where you have countries like China and Russia that are able to either buy a stake in like Associated Press and try to manipulate the media to publish more sort of anti-America articles or anti-West articles or pro-China articles and things like that. Whereas the West doesn't really have an avenue to do that with Chinese media since it's so tightly controlled and regulated by China. And I feel like we're in a situation now where foreign governments can use pliant media or media that's just looking to attack ruling dispensation or whatever to basically create instability domestically in these countries at the behest of these foreign countries. And in a situation like that, how do you traverse that situation where foreign countries can manipulate media and use your domestic media to manipulate people? Like, how do you deal with that?
No, this is increasingly a huge concern for
Hmm.
democracies around the world. And sadly, there are no easy answers to it. Now, what you can do is that you can hold media to greater accountability without imposing, you can impose checks and balances without imposing restraints.
Yeah.
And something like that has been attempted through the new IT rules which India has brought in, because, as I said, print and television is increasingly passe. We have to look at digital media, and that's why these new rules have been designed in a way that greater accountability is brought in.
Right.
Uh, Two, you see, a government by itself can do only a limited number of things. Whether it's the government of India or the government of America or government of Little England. So, what has to happen also, that consumers of news have to become more proactive. Now we
Right.
have something called the Press Council of India in India. Now it is supposed to be the watchdog of print media in this country. Now I remember when I was in very active journalism, uh, individual readers would approach the Press Council of India with complaints. And somebody had a, so I know this because somebody had a problem with something that I had written, and that person approached the Press Council of India. The Press Council of India took up the case. I had to put up a lawyer to argue my case, and then I won the case. But that's a different
Hmm.
thing. Now, that kind of public engagement has more or less disappeared in India, at least. You have
Right.
very few people who would not only approach the Press Council of India, but also aggressively push the envelope with the Press Council of India. Similarly, when there is this thing that, oh, what is the use of approaching the courts? The courts will never give a ruling. That is not quite true. When Jagmohan was slandered over the Kashmiri exodus, I think it was Blitz or someone, and he actually went to court. And this I'm talking of 1990s
Mm.
and early 1990s, and he went to court and he got a very early ruling. So, because he kept on pushing, he demanded a day-to-day hearing. He said, "I am prepared. I will not let you get away with it." So, if consumers of news, instead of just only outraging on social media or sort of posting on Facebook and Twitter or WhatsApp groups, if they were to push the envelope with the Press Council of India, and in America, for instance, if you have a watchdog body with them, uh, and therefore you also put media on notice
Mm.
that you cannot get away with sort of bluffing us. But there are, of course, other ways of bringing in controls. Now, for instance, I have no doubts in my mind that there should be an end to foreign sponsored supplements in newspapers or on television
Right.
channels. Now we have newspapers in India, the Indian Express, the Hindu, which carry multi-page supplements paid for by China on what a great
Oh
country
wow.
China is, how the flowers in China smell better than flowers in India, how the water in China is more pure than
I
and
didn't know that.
sweeter than the water in India. Now, they're paid, I mean, and they don't even hide the fact that these are paid supplements.
Yeah.
Now we
So
can
I'll tell
at
you.
least bring in I mean, there should at least be a rule that you have to mention on that supplement how much has the paper been paid for
Mm.
carrying that supplement.
Yeah.
So this
So
reminds me
that
of a
kind
very
of
funny.
transparency has to be forced. And
Mm.
unless we are talking about transparency and forced transparency, legally, lawfully forced transparency, there is very little that we can do, and it's only going to escalate.
Yeah. What were you saying,
So
Ahmed?
You
I
know,
was saying
I
that
don't know
this
how
reminds me
much
of a very
time
funny.
I
Sorry,
don't know
sorry,
how
Kanchan
much
ji.
time you have. I don't know how much time you have left, but
Mm.
I just wanted to tell you. I mean,
Sure, sure. Go
and
ahead.
through you, I would also like to tell people that media was never quite squeaky clean. I mean,
Mm.
it was never quite the epitome of virtues. It was never quite the repository of all that is good and
Yeah.
virtuous in this world. Uh, I will just give a couple of examples. One, in 1938, Evelyn Waugh wrote and published a book called The Scoop. The book is still available. I mean, you can order it online. And I always recommend people who want to join media or who want to talk about media or who are interested in media to read this book. So in 1938, you had media and and a journalist and his paper manufacture or create an imaginary war somewhere to report on it and to build a career and push up sales. So we are
Mm.
talking of 1938. And we also know where the phrase uh, harlot without responsibility comes from. This was the description of a mainstream British newspaper, which sort of failed to live up to the standards it was expected to.
Mm.
A second example, and this is a real life lived example. Uh, when I was when I was a callow journalist, I think uh, I had barely been in journalism for 6 months or 7 months or maybe a year. Those days there used to be a magazine called Sunday.
Right.
I don't know how many people remember it now. It was edited by MJ Akbar, and it was the biggest selling magazine. And it had a brilliant journalist called Masudul Haq. Now, Masood, I got to know Masood while I was in college, and he was partially uh, uh, instrumental in getting me into journalism. Masood and I shared a common interest in theater, but that's a different story.
Right.
Now, Masood did a did what is today called an investigative report, and it was such a brilliant report. He spent months working on that story. There was a Gwalior Rayan grasim factory, and the effluent, and this is before NGT days, before pollution and contamination were fashionable. So, how effluents from that factory were polluting the waters of a river in Madhya Pradesh, and
Hmm.
how that contaminated water was causing deformities at birth and other kinds of diseases. Now, it was a documented story with photographs, with medical reports, lab reports, everything. And to be honest, Sunday ran that story. It splashed it all over the cover, and it was suddenly everybody was talking about this thing called Grasim, about pollution, about contamination, about effluents, etc.
Yeah.
Now, once that happened, Gwalior Rayan got through to Anand Bazar Patrika, which is the publisher, and said that all our advertising for the next year is cancelled, and please don't come back to us for further advertising.
Wow.
Now, and in the 1980s, 83, 84, when sector was like, private sector players, you could count them off on your fingertips.
Yeah.
And Gwalior Rayan was one of the big spenders. The moment they did that, the management of Anand Bazar Patrika panicked,
Hmm.
and they wanted Masudul Haq to run a story contrary to what he had written,
Oh
and sort
wow.
of a mea culpa piece.
Yeah.
Masood said he won't do it. They tried to get it done by other journalists working for the state for Sunday. They
Yeah.
refused to do it. They got a journalist in Anand Bazar Patrika called Tushar Pandit to write out uh, that story, that everything is fine with Grasim, and their effluents actually add health benefits to the river
Oh
water
my
and
God.
things like that. Uh, and that story was
That's crazy.
published. And
Yeah.
after that story was published, Masood resigned. And Masood
Oh wow.
said, I shall never put pen to paper again. And he went back to theater and filmmaking and whatever. So that is Masood's story.
Hmm.
Now, Tushar Pandit, we were young, we were hot blooded. I was a member of the IFWJ, Indian Federation of Working Journalists. Some of
Hmm.
us ganged up and we confronted Tushar Pandit and said, how could you do it? I mean, this is prostitution.
Yeah.
And Tushar Pandit says, and subsequently the same comment came out in print, I think in Illustrated Weekly, which was then edited by Pritish Nandi, uh, that a journalist is a prostitute and does what the master wants to be done.
Wow.
So, to think that that media was some great virtuous
Yeah.
uh, goddess of virtue till it was disrobed and dishonored um, uh, in our times. That is not quite true. That is not so.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Ahmed,
basically
you had a story, right?
you said that is fake news years before Donald Trump. Yeah, I heard a story what you said about paid articles. That
Yeah.
also reminded me of a very funny story from some 10 years ago. Arindam Chaudhary, mentioned
That's
that.
right. I remember. Yeah.
Yes, that Deccan Herald has given us a very good, has written all these good things about our college.
Yeah.
The truth is that he had taken out an ad in Deccan Herald, and they actually published a clarification. We never said this. This fellow took out an ad with us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
That's
the lengths
that's a
people
very good
go to.
example as well. Yeah.
Uh,
You know, so finally, before we let you go, Kanchanda, keeping whatever we've talked about today in mind, you have a situation where mainstream media is struggling for, obviously, keeping up with social media content. They're struggling for money, they're struggling for viewership. You have people like Joe Rogan who have an audience that is bigger than New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, all of these outlets combined. His viewership is bigger. Keeping all that stuff in mind, which way do you see the media landscape going? And what happens with these organizations that are flailing right now, like a CNN, like a Washington Post, like a New York Times? You have so many of these journalists that used to be employed with them, journalists that I at least consider to still have some credibility. They've all left CNN, New York Times, and they're all like publishing articles on Substack where they have this subscription monthly, and they just publish whatever the hell they want to publish. Do you see more and more people going
Oh,
towards sort
oh
of that
yes.
route? Or yeah.
See, this is where we began, and as I said, that everything is in a flux right now.
Huh.
The print media is smokestack industry. It is on its way out. It's on its last legs. Uh, the television, yes, I mean it will be around because there is some amount of entertainment involved.
Yeah.
People who are tired at the end of a working day, they may want to switch on TV and look at news or whatever. But it will increasingly, its viewership will increasingly decrease. Most of the action, it has largely shifted, and it will increasingly shift to platforms like YouTube. you know Television channels now try to rate themselves by number of viewers on YouTube. So that is an indication of things to come. Then you
Yeah.
have alternative platforms like Medium and Substack, where people are trying to monetize their writing, or their talk shows. You gave the example of Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't know whether you monetize your show, and if you do, what kind of business model it is.
Yeah.
But I'm sure people are now trying to look at it in an entirely different manner, and it is something which can be done. Young Indians today, they know that if they have the equipment, they can go out and start doing stories. Again, I'm not commenting on the quality of the stories, the quality
Sure.
of the content, but it is getting increasing traction. And lastly, there is something which is happening. I am i live in a village. Actually, I literally live in a village. I would like to know what is happening in my village,
Hmm.
or in the district in which my village is located. I am increasingly disinterested by what is happening in my state capital, in my state, in my country, and the world at large. Now, we may love to think that what is happening in Afghanistan is of great consequence to readers and viewers in Bareilly, but it is not so.
Yeah.
And the white media may think that what is happening in Kashmir is causing great alarm in Kanyakumari. It is not quite so.
Yeah.
So now this contraction of interest has also squeezed out big players. They don't know what will work with people, what will work with viewers, readers. So I think it's something. I mean, everything is in a flux,
Sure.
but the future definitely excludes print medium, and in the long term, even television.
Very finally, I had a couple of questions from the audience, Kanjana, that I wanted to just put to you that they had asked. The Desi Thinker is saying, if let's say another government was in power, do you think that these media houses would continue with the same sort of anti-India COVID stories or the level of anti-India coverage? And if yes, then are there any attempts to engage with US based alternative media houses to tackle the narrative against India?
No, yes. I don't think white media was ever India friendly.
Sure.
People forget, but the Guardian correspondent was frog marched, literally frog marched, in the dead of night from home to airport when Indira Gandhi was prime minister. Uh, so there has been a constant friction between white media and India, and white media and India government. So this is not some, maybe it has sort of become more uh, acute over the last few years, but it
Yeah.
has always been like that. Uh, Two, we are now, I mean, not only we, I mean, and I don't mean we as a government,
Sure.
but everybody who is in the business of communications, or who's in the business of designing communication models, is increasingly looking at alternative media, is looking at alternative platforms, is looking at non-traditional media, non-traditional platforms, and maybe that's the reason why I'm spending more than an hour talking to Sham.
Well, I'm happy about that. I'm happy
Sham,
you
would you
would.
like to,
Huh,
since Joe Rogan came up and we are talking about media deception, would you like to
huh.
share that Instagram post, the latest war between Joe Rogan and CNN?
Yeah,
They've been trying to defame him
wasn't
for
there
Joe
a
Rogan for
crazy
giving
one?
false.
Let me see if this
Just
is the
just
one that
filling
you
people up on this.
shared.
Basically, that CNN is in a war with Joe Rogan. They're trying to defame him that he's giving deceptive wrong medical information.
Yeah,
So he put up an Instagram post, and just look at that post. It's self-explanatory. The way
yeah.
they're making
Here's
him
the
look
post,
bad.
I think, right? Yeah.
Hmm.
And it turns out I got COVID. So we immediately threw the kitchen sink at it. All kinds of meds, monoclonal antibodies, ivermectin, Z-Pack.
Yeah. So essentially, what he's talking about how he got COVID, and
Hmm.
the bottom video is the video that he shared himself, recorded and shared. The video
Hmm.
above it is the video that CNN shared on their platform and applied this weird brown gray filter on his face to make him look even more sick than he really was, which is frankly it's unbelievable, and it sort of goes into what we've been talking about for the past hour or so. So yeah, it is going to
And if you
be
notice, if you look
it's
closely, it's only his face. The trees, the leaves are
yeah,
of the same
everything else
color.
is fine.
Everything else is fine, just his face.
Just his face has got this. Yeah,
Hmm.
so there's that insecurity that we were talking about, and it's going to be very interesting to see how this platform develops, or what takes its place. One can make a very good argument that Joe Rogan has already taken the place of mainstream media. I mean, he is mainstream media basically at this point, judging by viewership. So, but yeah, we'll
Somebody had
continue
commented,
to,
why are these alt platforms getting so popular? Because simple reason, they just tell the truth.
or at least there is at least the stigma that is attached to mainstream media is not attached to these platforms yet. I mean, if you look
You
at
know,
the
Ahmed,
Wire or something like the yeah, go
you
ahead,
know,
Kanchan.
Ahmed, you said that alt media is now getting traction because they tell the truth. I would put it
Hmm.
slightly differently.
Hmm.
Uh, it's because mainstream media has stopped telling the truth.
Hmm.
They have got too caught up in their fascination with creating a narrative that is totally disjoined, that is totally different from the reality out there, and and I think that is the reason why both credibility is gone and the demand has decreased.
Is it because they have this feeling that they have this power and they can actually influence people? Is it that God complex, you think?
Of course, that we are the people who brought Nixon down. So if we could bring Nixon down, we can bring Modi down. Now, but they don't realize that that was a different age, different time, and this is a different age and different time.
Yeah.
Two, even in America, no paper, neither the Washington Post, nor the New York Times, or whatever, can bring a president down. So if Mr. Trump lost the election, it was not because of media.
Hmm.
I mean, the media may have played an incidental role, but uh, it's those days are gone, Ahmed. They're gone. I mean, those days whenever it rained in Moscow, uh, umbrellas would come out in Delhi. So it doesn't work like that anymore.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very, very finally, I just want to thank you, Kanchanji, for taking the time out today to come on the show and talk to us. This is something I've been meaning to talk to you for a while, and I appreciate you giving us the time. I appreciate Ahmed for joining in the conversation. And if you have anything to add, Ahmed, before we take off.
Just one last comment. I say media
go
has
for it.
come full circle from that New York Times article I shared. It has come full circle from milk allowance to milk is white supremacist.
Math is white supremacy. And
2 + 2 = 5.
yeah, you have this. There was this incredible bloody leaked document from Maryland University where they had some data about what kind of students that they're admitting and what kind of students that they need to admit into the universities. So they had two columns. The first column was white and Asian, and the second column was people of color. So now officially in government in university documents, Asian people are not considered people of color anymore in America. And you've seen that with that Harvard scandal as well, when like Asian students have sued Harvard for discrimination. So
Yeah.
that's where we are essentially. Now I'm
sort
a
of-
white guy now, apparently.
A sort of
According
positive
to the
discrimination where where the cutoff for them is a lot higher
Yeah,
because of the stereotyping that these people are smart
yeah,
and they're being penalized for it.
yeah. So essentially, according to woke media, it's this podcast has just been three white guys talking about white media. That's what this podcast
Because
has
whiteness is not a race, it's an attitude.
Exactly, it's an attitude. But very finally, thank you again, Kanchanji.
Thank you,
If
sir. Thanks a lot.
you guys all know where to follow Kanchanji, you know where to follow Ahmed. And if you like today's podcast, guys, make sure to like, share, subscribe, abuse us in the comments as well. All of that stuff helps. If you are not already a subscriber on Patreon or a member on YouTube, go ahead and do that, because Kushal and I are actually doing a long discussion about vaccine hesitancy and COVID stuff in the US. So that'll probably come out on like Friday or Saturday. So go ahead and subscribe to the Patreon if you haven't already. Other than that, we'll see you on Thursday for our main podcast and the meme review. Until then, stay happy, stay healthy. We'll see you then. Tata, bye bye.
See you. Good night.